Good afternoon. If you could all take your seats, we'd like to get started. We have a very packed agenda and a lot to cover in the next 3 hours, so we want to try to stick to schedule. I thank you. First, I want to thank our panelists for coming here, both our local panelists and those who came from out of town. It's also very nice to see so many people here in the commission meeting room. Obviously, these are very important issues, and this is certainly an expression of interest on everyone's part to see you here. I want to start by introducing Sherrese Smith. She is an advisor to Chairman Julius Janikowski, and she will say a few words.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here today. I apologize for the stuffiness, but I have a slight cold. I'm here on behalf of the chairman because we wanted to reiterate something that the chairman has said in the last few weeks, that he said prior to his confirmation hearings, during his confirmation hearings, and since the time he started. The VRS program is an extremely important and valuable program. Let me say that again. This is an extremely important and valuable program, and we are committed to keeping the program and to having it run in a way that is efficient and effective for the people who it serves. So we are delighted to have this workshop today, which we believe will be the kickoff for really making this program a vibrant program, one that works and operates the way it should be, and one ultimately that will serve the consumers who are desperately in need of the services. I want to take time out on behalf of our office to thank the people on the panel who, came and donated their very valuable time to help us start to talk about these issues. I want to thank the people in the audience who are out here also willing and able to help us tackle a lot of these difficult issues. And it will be a very good afternoon where we expect to learn a lot and to hear a lot. Our office is always open. This is not the first, nor will it be the last time that we talk about this. So we want to let you know that we are here for you, and we are thankful and grateful that we are tackling this very important issue. And now I have the opportunity to introduce Joel Guerin, who is the new chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Office here at the Commission. Joel.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherrese. I apologize. I have a previous commitment and can only stay for a few minutes today. But you're in very good hands with some very experienced and able people in our bureau. I want to echo what Sherrese said. The future of VRS is a very high priority for the Commission, and I can tell you that in the Consumer and Government Affairs Bureau, nothing is a higher priority for us than ensuring that this very valuable service continues on a sound footing. We know that it's been really a transformational service for the community, and we also know how important it is to keep it on a solid footing so that it can continue to serve those needs better and better in the future. I do want to say that our door is also open. I have now been on the job for exactly 1 week and 1 day, and I'm learning a lot about this and other issues, but I look forward to speaking with you in the future and learning as much as I can from many of you as we continue to work on this issue. Thank you very much for being here today. Your participation is very important to us, and I think it's going to be an excellent and very important session. Thank you.
Thank you to both to Sherrese and to Joel. I saw so many familiar faces in the audience that I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Michael Jacobs. I'm a legal advisor to Joel, to the chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. I can tell you that we are very pleased to have Joel aboard as our new chief with his extensive experience with consumer issues for years, serving as executive VP at Consumers Union, dealing with policy issues in the consumer interests. We're expecting very good things. He's already trying to really immerse himself in all of these issues, and we expect very good things going forward. My co-moderator, I think, is known to all of you, and that's Greg Leibach in our Disability Rights Office. And I want to invite Greg to say a few words to the group.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to see each of you here. Your presence here signifies your commitment to this important cause. Today's workshop brings us an historic opportunity to reevaluate and review video relay service and the program as a way to build on its strengths as well as weed out its deficiencies. VRS has come a long way since the mid-90s when we first experimented with it. In fact, this coming March of 2010 will mark the 10th anniversary of the Commission recognizing VRS as a form of telecommunications relay service compensable from the Interstate TRS Fund. VRS, from the very early days of its founding until now, has proven to be a service that no one ever imagined it would be. It looks so different than what we ever imagined it could be. Obviously, all of you know that it has proven to be immensely popular. And it has profoundly affected deaf and hard of hearing Americans' lives in a way that was just not conceivable. As an example, VRS allows you to view a person's face, facial expressions, and body language, and allows the hearing person to get that message, get the emotions being portrayed by the caller. And that's just one of the numerous benefits that I could list. Those types of benefits are not available through text relay. However, the naiveness of the service is now gone. And it's unfortunate that the purpose of VRS has been distorted for the financial gain of some individuals, some in illegitimate ways. The purpose of VRS is to enable deaf and hard of hearing Americans to have barrier-free communication over the telecommunications system under Title IV of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We today must work in partnership to address those abuses in order to preserve and protect the integrity of the Interstate TRS Fund, as well as the public's confidence in the VRS program itself. We have to ensure that VRS continues to be the essential tool that it is for communication for every deaf and hard of hearing American. I look forward to a productive meeting with you today.
Thank you very much, Greg. One other thing I wanted to mention, Mark Stone, who is the Deputy Chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, who oversees these issues and who did a wonderful job as acting chief of the Bureau while we were awaiting Joel's arrival. He has a sick daughter and had to attend to his fatherly duties, taking her to the doctor today. So he very much regrets that he couldn't be here. He was supposed to co-moderate with us, but hopefully he is following on the web. Before we get started with the substance, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping matters. One is almost all the issues that we'll be discussing here today have been teed up in various proceedings of ours, or various petitions that have been filed with us. Hence, they are subject to our ex parte rules. Now, the good news is that we're not expecting the panelists to all file ex parte presentations. We will have a transcript as well as the video of this afternoon's workshop put into the record, so no one needs to worry about ex parte filings. That's one thing. Just as far as, and now I'm talking to our panelists here, we also have participating by phone Dr. Greg Rosston of Stanford University. When you want to be recognized, I don't know if Dr. Rosston will be able to hold up a 10 card, so we'll listen for him chiming in. But for those of us who are here, when you want to be recognized to speak, please raise your tent card. This not only helps us, Greg and I as the moderators, know that you want to say something, it also helps our AV folks know that to turn on your mic when you're called upon. But once you do that, rather than continuing to hold it up, you can just sort of place it on its side like this, and that will again signal to us that you'd like to be recognized. Remember that the meeting is being video recorded. Again, this should help when you raise your tent card. That should help our AV folks recognize that to turn on your microphone. And the last thing, which I hope I'm doing myself, is they asked it to remind you to speak into the microphone, both for the sake of the recording, for Dr. Rosston's sake, for those who are following on the web. Other than that, we have, as I said at the very get-go, we have a very packed agenda. I'd like to get started on it. In a rarity, we're actually running a little bit ahead of time right now, which is good because we have a lot to cover. The first thing that we're going to do is invite each of our panelists to make an introductory statement. We're asking that you keep it to 3 minutes each. Again, just to keep things going. So we invite you to tell us a little about yourselves and whatever else you'd like to say as an introductory matter. And I guess we'll start with Jim Tobias and then just sort of make our way around the table and then conclude with Dr. Rosston.
Thank you. My name is Jim Tobias from Inclusive Technologies, and I want to echo Greg's memories of the earliest days of the prototype video relay service that we saw 10 years ago and more. I remember in a lab at Belcourt in New Jersey seeing the first applications of video telephony for sign language transmission, and it had that early movie look, that kind of Kitty Hawk look, where you knew this wasn't a fully formed technology yet, but it had tremendous promise. And it's been astonishing to watch the development of the service through the years. And now we might say that the service is in its difficult adolescent phase. It's gone through some problems. It's had some brush-ups with the law, and we need to take it aside and talk to it firmly but gently, and I think very positively. This is a very good time for us to review why we instituted video relay service in the first place and how we think it can be developed in the future. We should take this opportunity, I think, to be visionary about it in at least two ways. One is, I think we need to pay very close attention to the users. Who are the users of video relay service? Why do they use it? What are their preferences? How many people use it for what purposes, placing how many calls? Not to invade their privacy. I think their privacy, of course, must be the first thing that we seek to protect, but to understand why people use the service and how they want it to develop, we should focus on end users first and foremost. I think also we all know the developments in the world of technology are very dramatic and very rapid. And I think I would like to encourage the Commission to consider as video spreads out throughout the world. You know, we're pretty close to a situation where you can do live video on almost every device, including mobile devices, and in every location, every household, every business. There's no business too small that doesn't have a computer that either is already equipped with video capability or could be so equipped. And I think that will radically transform what we can do with video relay service. So I'd like to encourage us to focus both on the users, understanding their experiences with the service already and where they'd like it to go, and on the technology. Where can we adopt and adapt the developments in technology so as to continue to improve the service and simultaneously reduce its costs? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tobias. Sherry Farina, thank you for coming from California.
Hello from California. My name is Sherry Farina. I'm the CEO of NorCal Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I'm here today representing the California Coalition of Agencies Serving the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. We are an 8-sister deaf-run agency providing a variety of social services from job assistance to education, educational classes, advocacy, whether it's employment discrimination that's still happening out there, telecommunications, IEPs for children, parents with deaf children, et cetera, as well as keeping information out there to the deaf and hard of hearing individuals that we serve, including deafblind individuals and so forth. We serve everyone from the womb to the grave, the womb to the tomb, I should say. Just to let you know before I go on today, I conducted an informal VRS consumer poll to several hundred deaf consumers, specifically VRS consumers, to ask them questions related to the FCC's public notice. I think the public notice that you had, breaking everything down into 3 categories, to ask them what they would wish for me to share with you today. And I appreciate the opportunity to come today. Thank you very much. I also hope that we do understand that, yes, there is VRS abuse. However, I want to put it into proper perspective, and that we continue to look at the big picture. The United States GAO report from 2009 shows that in the area of government assistance programs alone, there's a $100 billion yearly improper payment, waste, fraud, and abuse made. That's not counting all the other types of abuse, of fraud that we know also happens out there in the government. For example, the military buying, $5 million worth of toilet seats, etc. However, so you understand what I mean. VRS abuse is happening, yes, and we need to get on top of it. And more may appear. However, it's not like it's the only horrible news out there. We can't let that destroy the most functionally equivalent service that a deaf and hard of hearing person has today, because consumers will not allow that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Farina. Sharon Hayes.
Hello, and I have my interpreter. Hello, my name is Sharon Hayes, and I am the director of the Video Relay Services Consumer Association, VRSCA. We are sponsored by Sorensen. However, we have approximately 12 people that are working with me currently throughout the United States. And we do make our own decisions based on the information that we want to share with the consumers in the communities who are using video relay service. There is really no consumer representative out there, really, except there are several VRS providers that focus on that. But the providers do have their own incentives. We do not have any incentive. We do not advertise, or we do not endorse Sorensen at all within our many town hall meetings and expos that we attend. We hand out materials, and we also share information clarifying some of the miscommunication that is out there. And some of the other providers are putting that miscommunication out there. And they have their reasons, and of course they're trying to sell their product, but we do need to have options. We do not want one provider to be monopolizing this service. The problem that we are seeing out there are that there are so many consumers that are new to this. VRS provides them freedom to be independent, and this, of course, is a very important part of our lives. We want to be able to be free to make our calls without relying on our children and our neighbors and our parents, relatives, or friends. And, I've, been to deaf schools. I myself have been spoon-fed information throughout the years. And now times have changed. And consumers now have the right of choice. They have the right to know what they can or cannot do, what's right and what's not right, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. And there are many new issues coming up with the consumers. So we do see the value in educating and empowering our consumers. We're not at a level playing field as of yet. We are actually far from functional equivalency. So I'm very thankful to the FCC for inviting us here today and to be able to make our comments, and our comments are coming from the consumer's perspectives. And also we have engineers here. We're going to hear their perspectives. And I know that we will be working towards a solution. And there is a problem out there that needs to be resolved. But we cannot stop. We need to continue to dialogue and to share and to make VRS better for our deaf and hard of hearing people. And I thank you.
Thank you. Now, Claude Stout.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Claude Stout. I'm the Executive Director of Telecommunications for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I'm also the Chair of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Consumer Advocacy Network. The network is a nationwide organization for deaf and hard of hearing, deaf-blind individuals. We represent 20 different organizations across the country, and I really appreciate the FCC hosting this workshop. You continue to walk the talk, and I congratulate the FCC for that. The FCC has their mandate from Congress through the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically Title IV, which is very important, to establish a nationwide telecommunications relay service program. And they have been performing an amazing job. And we've seen the program evolve over the years. And there's important language in the statute that I would like to emphasize, actually, and I do again and again every time I speak with individuals and in my analyses, is that we cannot discourage or interfere with the development of technology as the service is provided. This afternoon, I do know we will talk with on specific issues related to VRS. I understand that VRS is part of an overall TRS program, including internet relay, speech-to-speech, caption telephone relay, etc. So please let us remember there are various forms of relay out there that serve various deaf and hard of hearing individuals based on their need. Some who sign, some who don't, some who read lips, some who don't, etc. And we also need to be respectful of their diverse needs and apply what we're discussing today to other forms of relay service and to make sure that their communication needs are also met. One other group that we cannot, we cannot afford to forget is the hearing individuals. They have an equal stake in this service. They are also consumers of this service. TRS was established because we didn't want to burden businesses run by hearing individuals or hearing individuals to get a TTY and do 40 other things in order to talk with us. We wanted to make sure whatever technology they have, we can have too, and be able to communicate through relay as the middleman, so to speak, with each other. As Greg has said, in the last really 20 years, we have seen VRS change. We have internet relay, we have real-time text, we have caption telephone. That's just not on landlines. We're seeing it on the internet now. We have the I in front of everything now, CapTel, et cetera, IP CapTel. There's so many things going on, and there's so many things for us to consider in the future. It's important that this workshop be a beginning and a positive step forward. And I want the industry, I applaud, the industry for providing this service. I know we sometimes say you should do this and do this and do this and be critical of the industry. However, we want to also thank them for their hard work, as well as the FCC. I know the chairman is working hard to make sure that policies are in place that work for all of our benefits. So I look forward to today's discussion amongst the consumer groups. And again, I thank the FCC as well as the industry and others for making relay service what it is and as accessible as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. Rosaline Crawford.
Thank you. I'm Rosaline Crawford. I'm the director of the Law and Advocacy Center of the National Association of the Deaf. I want to follow up just a little bit on something Claude mentioned regarding the Americans with Disabilities Act, and in this next statement is some of that language that appears in the law itself. Relay services enable individuals with hearing or speech impairments to engage in communication in a manner that is functionally equivalent to telephone users. Relay services are intended to provide deaf, hard of hearing, late deafened, and deafblind people and people with speech impairments with equal access to the telephone network. The FCC must ensure that relay services are available to the extent possible and in the most efficient manner, and the FCC must not discourage or impair the development of improved technology. We support the availability, innovation, and advancement of high-quality and reliable relay services, maintaining the integrity of the Interstate Relay Service Fund, and FCC and other efforts to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. We support brand marketing by VRS providers and outreach and education to all Americans about all types of relay services. We support NAD-RID National Interpreter Certification, qualified interpreters, and adherence to the NAD-RID Code of Professional Conduct. We support FCC certification for VRS providers. Clear disclosure when a company is providing services for a certified VRS provider. We support use of FCC's enforcement authority to ensure providers meet relay service standards and requirements and do not engage in abusive or fraudulent activities. We support the operation of VRS as a competitive service under multi-year tiered price cap scheme, which is the current system that we have today, which rewards efficiency and increases market access. We support transparency in in the rate setting process and access to cost data so we can provide meaningful input. We support a VRS rate methodology that covers all reasonable expenses of VRS providers. We support addressing the issue of VRS equipment, including research, development, manufacturing, and installation costs, availability, affordability, and interoperability. And we support measures against fraud and abuse addressed in enforcement actions and not part of the rate-setting procedure. We urge the Commission to seek additional public comment on the issues presented today and to respond to the requests for clarification, rulemaking, and reconsideration in a timely manner. We also urge the Commission to increase staffing in the Disability Rights Office and include engineers and VRS users to address these issues. We appreciate the opportunity to participate in this workshop today. We seek continued improvement in the delivery of VRS and functional equivalency for all deaf and hard of hearing Americans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rosaline. Karen Peltz Strauss.
I'm here today representing the Coalition of Organizations for Accessible Technology and also as a historian of relay services. The coalition, also called COAT, is a group of over 270, 270, we increase every day, organizations that is working steadily to ensure that new technologies in the digital and internet arena are made accessible to people with disabilities. Many of you know me. I've had a long history. I love Jim's analogy to adolescence. I feel more like the analogy is to being a senior citizen. I've worked on relay services since they started, or at least since they became mandated. I helped write the law requiring relay services. I was at the FCC and helped draft the provisions that required or that created approval for VRS. Many of you know that I have worked for a provider. I am no longer working for a provider and am a consumer advocate for the purposes of this proceeding. I am not being sponsored by a provider. I also served on the NECA advisory board. So I kind of come at this from a historian's perspective. I think that the FCC overall has done a marvelous job with TRS. I think that the last 8 years, VRS has suffered some, and we need to get back on track. The most important thing is, as Rosaline alluded and various people have alluded here, is for greater transparency. It's not clear what the rate covers. We need to make that open. We need to get feedback from the public and have the FCC have an open process whereby the public understands what the rate is covering. There needs to be greater efforts to have periodic meetings between the FCC and both consumer groups and provider groups. I know that in the past, providers have pushed the limit. They've engaged in a lot of different schemes, some of them marketing, some of them other, but efforts to get feedback from the FCC in the past were not forthcoming, and there needs to be a much greater dialogue and more openness in that dialogue so that providers understand what can be done and what can't be done, and consumers know what providers are planning on doing as well. The certification process needs to be improved. Right now it's not very clear who's monitoring it. It's not clear that the applications are being reviewed as thoroughly as they need to be reviewed. If there are companies that are working with other companies, it's not clear that the FCC has oversight over all of those companies, so there has to be greater oversight as well. Most importantly, there needs to be greater staff at the FCC. We can't emphasize this enough. There is a backlog of petitions that the FCC has. I know I don't have to tell Greg and Mike this, that I was thinking about adding them up, and I decided that would be too painful, but there's just a huge backlog. can't emphasize enough to the chairman's office that this office, the Disability Rights Office and CGB, needs more staff to address what has become close to a $1 billion program. There needs to be greater monitoring of this program, clearly. I mean, we've all agreed to that, but it has to happen through audits. It has to happen through comprehensive and sophisticated measures that take into account engineering concerns, research concerns, and economic concerns, all of which need to be going hand in hand with efforts to achieve functional equivalency. I had the opportunity to speak to Sherry the other day on a point-to-point video call. Several of us did. And I was horrified at how inadequate and how not functionally equivalent the experience was. So I think that moving forward, the FCC not only needs to fix what's been broken, but it needs to surge ahead and make sure that this program can take advantage of new video technologies. What that is going to mean, in part, is greater interoperability with mainstream technologies. Because if that doesn't happen, then VRS is going to remain in its own silo and continue to be separate. I said to Sherry, use Skype. I've had better experience on Skype than I had on with that, and it just seems like everybody's moving towards video. We cannot keep this service isolated from the progress that other video communications are about to achieve. And in fact, one of the things that Code is working with, as you know, is a law in Congress, 3101, and video conferencing, if that law gets passed, would be covered. I'm set on a new mission now to get that fixed. That was just horrifying to me, the experience that we had. The screen kept freezing, there was pixelization, it was just totally inadequate. So I'll stop there, and I really want to thank the FCC for doing this. I hope that this is the first of several forums or efforts to get these problems corrected.
Thank you very much, Karen. Dr. Krishna Jayakar.
Good afternoon, and first of all, thanks to the Disability Rights Office for arranging this event and for inviting me to speak. It's a great opportunity to be able to present some of my thoughts on this topic. But let me begin with a confession. My main area of research over the last 15 years or so is the Universal Service Fund, and that is where I do most of my research. Most recently, a group of us at Penn State and several other universities, 12 different universities actually, put together a book of recommendations on media policy and telecom policy for the new administration. It was published as a book called And Communications for All, and the title says it all. We really believe, the group of people that came together behind that book, believe that communications in the emerging information society is a fundamental need, it's a fundamental necessity, and we should do something together as a government and as a society to enable universal communication access. But having said that, I do see many similarities between things going on in the universal service debates and the VRS debates. Obviously, the objectives of the two policies are quite similar, that is to enable universal access. The funding mechanisms are very similar. Both are funded through contributions from telecom providers. And some of the problems that they face are also quite similar. I recently completed a series of articles on the E-rate program, which went through a cycle of complaints and allegations against some providers and instances of fraud and abuse that made big headlines in the media and brought the whole program into disrepute. So I can see where some of the problems could be with the VRS program as well. So there is lots to talk about in terms of similarities between these programs. But again, I'm relatively new to the VRS debates compared to many of you here around the table. So sometimes it might sound as if I'm talking a foreign language or in a foreign accent, which I am in more ways than one. So thanks again for inviting me, and I look forward to the debate to come.
Thank you very much for being here. One thing before we ask Dr. Rosston to to say something. I was remiss in not thanking Diane Mason, an attorney in our Disability Rights Office. She led a team, including other members of our Consumer Affairs and Outreach Division, in putting together this workshop. So thank you very much for your efforts on that, Diane. Now, if we could ask Dr. Greg Rosston to say a few words.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I want to thank you. Thanks to the FCC for organizing this. I'm actually watching this on the web from my desk and wondering if you're going to put a picture of a speakerphone up or how I'm going to be seen on this. I first got involved with VRS about 3 years ago when Sorensen asked me to undertake a strategy project for them to understand how competition might evolve in this industry. While I've done work for Sorensen in the past, the FCC asked me here today to speak as an independent academic, so these are my views alone. In my brief opening remarks, I wanted to make 4 points, and I'll list the points and then talk about them. The first is that as you've heard already from the other panelists, the communication world for hearing impaired people has changed dramatically over the past few years. The second point that I think is different than what most other people have talked about is that the economics of VRS are relatively straightforward. Third is that the FCC should attempt to harness market mechanisms to ensure quality, access, and low prices. And fourth is that enforcement of the rules are important. So I'm going to expand on each of these because I think they're going to provide the framework for my answers to questions in the upcoming topics over the course of the afternoon. First, VRS has expanded dramatically. About 5 years ago, there were less than 20,000 VRS users. Prices per minute were extremely high, answer times were long, and the equipment wasn't very good. 3 years ago, answer speeds had decreased, installations had gone above 50,000, and today prices for the government, who is the customer, not the user, have gone down. Installations are probably above 100,000, and minutes of use per user are relatively high. I don't have the requisite information as an economist to determine the value of the expansion of the service, in part because it's provided for free. But I know it's worth something something, and you hear from a lot of the panelists today that it's quite valuable. But at least at this point in time, I can't quantify how valuable it is to know whether or not what's being spent and what's being valued is commensurate. On the economics of this, VRS is a labor-intensive business. As you all can see in the audience, there's a video interpreter right now for me, and each minute of VRS communication requires more than a minute of interpreter time because time is required for the call setup and tear down, and also to ensure that VRS users don't have long hold times to get a VRS interpreter. In addition to paying the VRS interpreters for their time, there are a number of other costs that VRS providers have, but the main driver in cost is the cost of interpreter time. And so the fact that we've had a 5-fold increase in communication means that there's roughly 5 times as many interpreters needed, or as much interpreter time. And that doesn't engender economies of scale. In fact, I think the opposite is probably true. Increased demand requires higher wages to induce a higher quantity supplied of video interpreters. Finally, I want to talk about market mechanisms. As Professor Jayakar has said, that at least my research is also focused on universal service, and there are ways in the universal service that the FCC is considering to try to hold down costs for universal service for telephone service, and I think that they can use similar mechanisms as price caps and possibly auctions to think about using competitive mechanisms to hold down the cost. And I think the FCC should think about what is appropriate in this case to provide the incentives for competition. Right now, the different VRS companies compete on quality to get users, and that's important. That's gotten VRS to be expanded as much as it has been, and I think the FCC now needs to ensure that the companies who provide the service continue to be able to provide the services, to continue to be able to provide the capital equipment necessary and investment necessary to provide the high-quality services. But the FCC also needs to ensure that there's not the waste, fraud, and abuse that we've heard about. So I think I'll stop there, and then in my answers you'll probably hear me reiterate the fundamental economics of the business and the incentives for competition to provide high quality and low costs. And thank you very much for having me and for holding this important hearing.
Thank you very much for participating from over there in California. Now I think we'll move on to the meat of the presentation. As the news release set forth, there are three broad categories of topics that we're going to address this afternoon. One being fraud and abuse, another being the most efficient way to deliver VRS while maintaining functional equivalency, and the third being a fair and transparent compensation methodology. Obviously, there are going to be some overlaps between these topics, but we're going to try to stick to those categories of topics when we talk. So first, we'll talk about fraud and abuse. Unfortunately, that has been sort of the big news of late, or of most recently in VRS, that counteracts all of its wonderful benefits. Want to start by addressing that question, the very fundamental question of how can the commission best address areas of potential fraud? What can we do about that? Sure.
Ready? I want to pick up on something that Karen had mentioned. And, oh, the gentleman on the phone, I'm sorry, I'm absolutely blanking on his name. Help me out. I'm sorry, I was up at 5 o'clock this morning. Please apologize if I blank out on something. In regards to auditing, as the CEO of a community-based organization, and as I have been for a while, if I see fraud or abuse, the first question I would ask is, why didn't I see it? Because to me, what is the FCC doing to look at itself and think, why didn't we, as the FCC, catch it earlier? Which goes back to the comment that I made earlier about the big picture. I believe that the FCC needs to set the example by sharing its own strategic plan, and show the OIG data, the Office of Inspector General's office, have them conduct financial audits to ensure that there is accountability and transparency within the FCC itself. The last audit that is shown on the FCC's website, specifically from the OIG's website, was 2006. So I'm hoping that the FCC has been auditing itself since 2006. If it is, it's not on your website. That's just an example. But if you want others to do certain things, you need to set the example and demonstrate the type of transparency that you're talking about and that you want to see your contractors doing, with the proper safeguards, management practices, and oversight from within the FCC itself, as well as NECA and providers. We should be able to, with that, prevent future fraud and abuse. I believe that the FCC needs to establish a performance-based management accountability procedures to validate the accuracy of the information that is submitted, statistics and so forth, as well as do its own internal assessment and risk assessment to develop strategic input from OIG, provide technical assistance to providers, train, perform quality control to ensure that the audits are being properly conducted and that there is no improper payment, and if there is, it is reported appropriately. The FCC needs to do an audit of the entire program, as well the FCC's part, NECA's part, and the VRS provider's part. The whole thing needs to be looked at. You need to be able to capture whatever's going on, and then from an independent auditor. Hopefully they will be able to identify weak areas, and I think that will then become the FCC's roadmap as to what really needs to be done. Right now we're guessing. We can't blame anyone because we're guessing. We need to go back where the whole thing started, and everything starts with, quote, us, meaning the FCC. Consumers have expressed a laundry list of other ways to combat fraud and abuse. From what they've told me, they would like to see the FCC establish a fraud and abuse prevention hotline for consumers specifically, to be able to call in and have that hotline be managed and run by a deaf or hard of hearing individual. Just contract it out. And also specifically have a whistleblower hotline that is accessible and provide direct communication. Really, direct communication is much better than having to go through an interpreter or other third party. You should also require all providers to put the FCC's contact information on their websites in a clearly visible manner, so that if anyone has a problem, they've seen waste, fraud, or abuse, they can know who to contact and do so immediately. Many consumers responded to me saying that they would like to see the white label programs completely terminated, and instead, for example, one thing that I saw was a desire to establish a provisional certification for the newer, let's call them, companies. And I'll respond more to that comment later on your number 4 that you submitted to us. OIG should require NECA to establish clear guidelines, expectations, and outcomes. Even to me, as a consumer from the outside, I'm really not clear as to what's going on. I see some reports now, some percentages of ups and downs, and minutes being under-projected or over-projected, but the moment that something happens, NECA needs to be more timely in reporting to the FCC, have a much quicker turnaround time of noticing any unusual rise or declines in the number of minutes, and basically any change in pattern.
Sherry, I want to, you've had the floor for a while now. You know, we have a lot of ground to cover. I want to open,
I'm sorry, I was just giving what the consumers had given to me.
Yeah, no. We certainly appreciate the feedback. And
I have 2 more if you'll let me finish.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
Another piece of input I received was one consumer suggested requiring having electronic monitoring mechanism to quicker catch deficiencies and abuse. And lastly, to require that all providers be upfront with their costs, policies, and be transparent within their own companies, as well as whatever their policies are on their code of business conduct, as well as ethics. There also needs to be a serious effort made on consumer education. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll let Claude address these issues.
I agree with you, Sherry. The FCC needs to get some outside consultation on how best to prevent this fraud and abuse from happening in the future. One way is to maybe have an NOI or an NPM, NPRM, so that providers can do their jobs better to provide that abuse from happening. Okay, we as consumers agree that for example, the staff within the Disabilities Right Office only has 3 or 4 people doing the monitoring and seeing what's happening with the TRS industry, which is nationwide, $900 million industry. That's insane. I think that we should have perhaps 30 staff to monitor this huge industry. Now, the FCC's in response to this first issue was to get some, good people involved, engineers, and people who are familiar with, the deaf culture and community, and sociologists, and bring them together. That allows them to do their job better, but they can also do their job better with providers, to having clear reports, and having that data out there so that the specifics are given to people. We need this from the providers when the FCC makes the request. The FCC could do their jobs better if they were able to meet with industry as a whole on a more frequent basis. That would avoid misunderstandings. Then they could discuss what's lawful and discover what's unlawful with their business practices. And Sherry's right. It's important to have a whistleblowing program. One for interpreters and a separate one for consumers. We encourage DRO to work with the administrators of other funds, such as the Universal Fund, to see how they prevent fraud and abuse from happening. See what metrics they are using and what tools they're using, and we can maybe copy those. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. One suggestion is that the providers work more with recording conversation minutes time as opposed to session time. FCC has the responsibility now with their policies to rework that as well. So there would be less burden on the interpreters in that regard.
Thank you, Claude. Karen?
Thank you. I agree with Claude and Sherry that there needs to be a whistleblower program. I've heard many times that interpreters are afraid to come forward because they're afraid they'll lose their jobs. And we're talking about clear abuse, not coming forward to talk about call content. And I've heard that consumers are afraid to come forward because they're afraid they'll lose their equipment. We've heard that for years. I think that this is such an amazing program for consumers that, it's the lifeline to have a telephone, to have access to other people. And the fear of losing one's equipment is overpowering. We've heard this for, like I said, about 5 years now. As I mentioned before, I think it's really important for the FCC to be very upfront with providers on what is permitted and what is not. And there have been times that providers have gone to the FCC or consumers or somebody have reported an activity that's inappropriate, and the FCC will either not do anything or just tell that provider to stop doing it. What the FCC needs to do is tell all providers every time they hear about any kind of scheme, if something is not permitted, it should be nipped in the bud right at the start. And so what I guess I'm trying to say is that this needs to be a proactive effort. Of course, there have to be ongoing, there has to be monitoring, reporting by providers, but there really needs to be much greater proactivity by the FCC. I mentioned that the certification process needs to be improved. I think that in the past, some providers have been certified that perhaps were not really providers. Rather, they might have been shells or companies that entered into the business just for revenue sharing arrangements. So I know that there's a notice of proposed rulemaking that's out and open on white labels and what should be a permitted provider. The FCC should really have strict qualifications to enter the field. Any provider that does enter the field should be certified. Right now, that's not the case. There are providers that are able to provide services just by virtue of either being a common carrier or by contracting with a state. There should be some leniency in having those providers apply for certification if they've already been providing services, and to a certain extent be grandfathered in. But going forward, it's silly to have different standards for who can provide service. This is a federally operated program. This is not run by the states. There is no state oversight. So if there is certification needed for some providers, there should be certification needed for all providers, and the FCC should take an active role in overseeing all providers. Just one or two more things.
Sure, I actually want to ask a question.
Sure.
About that, which is, an issue on the horizon at some point could be. It's been teed up a long time ago now, but especially now with the 10-digit numbering scheme, there's been some thought, or certainly maybe that cast as concern among some state regulators that this would provide opportunities to resolve jurisdictional separation of costs issues. Does that, if those issues were to be resolved at some point in the future and shifting some of the service back to the states, what effect would that have on what you're saying about certification?
I definitely want other consumers to respond to this as well, but I think that there's a tremendous concern that the way relay services in general have been handled by the states has not been as effective as having an interstate model. And one of the problems is that when it's given to the states, it is done by competitive bidding with one provider chosen. And so there has not been the selection, the competition, and the selection of services and features and innovation that has occurred on the federal level. So the other problem is that right now, VRS, and this is even a bigger problem, is that VRS is not mandated. And so if it was sent back to the states, they could just stop providing it, which is, the case for other relay services. We're a long way off from, I think, even considering that. I don't think that that's something that the consumers would sanction at this point. Just to finish really quickly, I just have one other point I want to make. Just that I can't emphasize enough the need for an oversight board. There needs to be an oversight board that monitors activity in this industry, maybe along the lines of USAC, that actively monitors this, and it needs to be made up of individuals who are completely independent of the industry. We do have the NECA advisory board. It is largely populated by members of the industry. There needs to be people on the board that do not have any kind of conflict of interest in overseeing VRS funding activities and marketing activities. And again, we're dealing here with a huge program, and without that, I just don't see, without active monitoring by some independent entity, whether it's within the FCC or contracted out by the FCC, I just think that you're going to continue to have these problems.
Thank you. Dr. Jayakar?
First of all, I would completely agree with Karen that that's one of my comments for later, that NECA's administration of the TRS fund seems to present some conflicts of interest. But the point I wanted to make about fraud is that in most markets, in any market, the primary defense against fraud and abuse, the primary monitor of quality is the consumer. The consumer is the person who looks at the product and sees if it is up to the standards that the vendor promises. But in the VRS case, that is slightly more complicated because the user is not the buyer. So users don't have an economic incentive to monitor the quality of the product as closely as they would had they been paying for it. I was wondering if there was some technical means of monitoring the number of minutes that users avail of without compromising privacy, which is also a concern, or if there was some means of creating an economic incentive for the user to monitor the number of minutes used. Now, this also would have the advantage of preventing anonymity of calling, because some of the fraud originated from anonymous users calling into the system and placing orders with e-commerce vendors. So those sort of abuses would also be controlled or even eliminated if it is possible to identify the originator of a VRS call.
Thank you. Rosaline?
Thank you. I'm going to echo a couple of the comments that have already been made, but one of the areas I think that the Commission, and certainly it's been teed up, Commission has been looking at and certainly teed up in some of the requests for rulemaking, are an effort to try to define the parameters of what is a reimbursable VRS call clearly, so that providers know, you know, what's an okay call and what's not an okay call. I think in this instance, we need to tread really, really, really carefully, because our bottom line as consumers is the functional equivalency golden standard. And a deaf or hard of hearing person, their right to make any call to anyone on the telephone network cannot be infringed in this process. That would be an absolutely horrible result. So I think when we're looking at the kinds of calls, I think we need to look at perhaps some other ways to define the call and what's permitted and what's not. For example, one of the practices that is currently under indictment is where an interpreter, a communication assistant, is told not to interpret. That can't be right, because the interpreter interpreting is the call and relaying the communication. So I think defining parameters on those lines, you know, to say what exactly functionally is the call, rather than the kind or the nature of the communication or the exchange of information that's happening on the call is really where we need to be looking at. And the other thing I think we need to do is try to get a handle on defining the parameters of legitimate business practices clearly. And again, I make reference to one of the behaviors that was cited in the indictments in somebody being paid to make calls, to profit financially by placing calls. And again, that can't be right. So I think there are some clear-cut behaviors and conduct that can be addressed without infringing on anyone's right to actually place the call and make that connection and get the communication and the information. I think that's what we need to keep in mind. And I caution to, you know, I express caution here, and I think a lot more dialogue on those kinds of issues. Again, I've already teed up, but I don't think there's been any public comment, a whole lot of public comment on that, and I think we need to have a whole lot of public input on those kinds of issues before the Commission takes any steps.
All right, well, thank you. I mean, we are here receiving comment, at least from the panelists. So I guess I would ask you, you've asked for some clear definitions about what's an impermissible practice, what's a legitimate or not a legitimate call. Can you elaborate on that a little? Like how you would set these definitions?
But this is Rosaline again, and I just pointed to the examples that were cited in the indictments, and I think that, you know, those are probably pretty good examples to start with in terms of what's not permissible. And it's conduct, not the nature of the call or the content of the call or the connection being made, but the conduct involved in the call.
This is Greg. I'd like to go back to some of the things that you've mentioned about having an open dialogue with providers. I understand that. How or what suggestions would you have for providers to be able to come forward to us to notify us of various call practices, maybe gray areas that may seem to be unethical or inappropriate. How can we really have an open dialogue? Because obviously there's a financial incentive for providers to have higher number of minutes and higher traffic. So do you have any suggestions on how we can truly have an open dialogue with them? Some call practices, often the FCC is not aware of until, some of the call practices we now are aware of, we weren't aware of until recently.
Claude.
This is Greg Rosston. Can you hear me?
Dr. Rosston, Claude Stout is going to talk, and then I'll call on you. Thank you.
Yes, you raised a valid question. Now, if the DRO had more staff, you would have the time and resources to engage in the dialogue with industry. If you had more staff, you could tell industry, I want to meet monthly. Those monthly meetings would then help with communication. You'd have more staff, you could ask more questions, you could address the concerns, you'd have the dialogue, and again, things would be placed in writing in terms of what agreements that you came up with as a result.
And that works only if the providers are willing to share that information with us. They have to be willing to do that, and that's the question. Are they willing to share that with us?
Yeah, I'd like to respond. Okay, you run the program. They want to work for your program. You tell them what you want to see happening, what you want done. You have a memo, it's clear policy instructions, and they will follow.
Dr. Rosston, and then Karen.
So I think that I sort of going to address a few things since I wasn't able to get in earlier. That clearly defining the rules is important. Your last question about how do you get dialogue, as an economist, there's a whole literature, and maybe this is sort of talking about fraud and abuse, so the economics of crime sort of plays in here. And one of the things that the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice has done is has a program where people who come in and essentially are whistleblowers on price fixers, that they themselves are involved in a price fixing agreement, they get a lighter sentence or lighter punishment. And there's an incentive for them to come in and point out practices where they've been agreeing with other people. If there are questionable practices that are highlighted by a single provider, you may try to come up with a way that says, if you come in and tell us about this practice, we will give you a lighter punishment than if we find out about them ourselves. And one of the other pieces that you sort of learn about from the economics of crime is that in order to have optimal deterrence, you have a harsher penalty if it's a very low probability of being caught. So I think what the previous speaker said about having more staff and other things means that you don't have to have as harsh a penalty. You increase the probability of being caught by having more whistleblower lines, by having more accessibility, but also make it clear what are and are not appropriate calls that should be compensated and those that should not be.
Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, I just want to add that I agree with all of the comments made. I have to think about that last one, because right now, I mean, there haven't been really any penalties other than the indictments. There haven't been a whole lot of cash penalties. Could be monies withheld, yeah. There have been monies withheld, that's right. I guess the way I feel about it is that disclosure to the FCC has not been the problem. I think it's the FCC's action that's been the problem. I mean, this is still a somewhat small community. People find out things almost as soon as they happen. And I mean, I've made many phone calls, as you know, to the FCC, and many of us have made many contacts to the FCC. The providers are constantly telling the FCC about things that other providers are doing. And I just don't see that as the problem. I think the problem has been that there hasn't been enough feedback from the FCC. I think that giving information to the FCC when problems arise has not been the issue. It's just that when the FCC doesn't act, then there's less incentive to provide that information. It's like, why bother providing the FCC with, if somebody would tell me, for example, about some practice that some provider was doing, it's like, well, why bother telling the FCC? They're not going to do anything. I think that once the FCC starts being more active and acting upon the issues and putting everything on the record, I mean, you could even have a VRS blog, like Band or whatever it's called. I mean, you could have this open. You can have a transparent social network tool to have people come forward to the FCC, open and on the record, and report what's going on. I think you're going to get a lot of information, more than you could ever imagine.
This is Greg. Could we possibly just pick one example of a call practice that the community has maybe not yet told the FCC about, but we have seen action on? I mean, can you pick an example of something that maybe you've told us about, but we've not yet acted on?
Yes, well, one is actually filed, and I hesitated to mention this because it was by the provider that I used to work for, but I'll mention it because it's very basic. It's automatic reporting of data. There's been a petition that was filed to get providers to automatically report the onset of minutes. It's very basic, and there are some allegations that, I don't know whether it's still going on, that some providers are manually counting the beginning of when a call starts. That's a very basic thing that could be corrected, and yet that petition has been sitting for several months, as far as I know. So that's just one example. I mean, there are really quite a lot of other examples. I'd rather not, pick any other out because it would single out certain providers, but that's just one very easy one that could have been resolved, almost overnight. I mean, it's so obvious that there should be automatic measures to determine when call minutes start and when they end.
Follow up on a couple of those points. I mean, one, I'm wondering, we've also heard a lot of suggestions about whistleblower protections and stuff. I'm wondering how that comports with your idea of blogs and complete openness in the enforcement arena. The other thing is we have processes under the Act for enforcement actions. Even at their best, they take several days and steps to implement. Some of the things that are brought to our attention are actions that we're being asked to put the kibosh on immediately. And I'm wondering what suggestions you would have for us to be able to do that, and that perhaps the providers would comply with, that would also meet satisfy our statutory criteria.
I have a comment, but I've been monopolizing the microphone, so why don't we give some other people an opportunity? But I definitely have a response, so when after other people have given some feedback, I'll share mine.
All right, Sharon.
Thank you, Karen, for that. Okay, a mechanism for preventing waste, fraud, and abuse. It's an important issue, and many of you have mentioned important points that I think many consumers would agree to. But I do want to add a few other things. One emphasis I would make is that there has to be some kind of clear rule, actually ground rules. When you have a team of providers and they don't know what to do, they don't know what's appropriate, what's permitted, and what's not, we need to have clear ground rules and what calls are allowed and what calls are not allowed. Without those ground rules, I think that you're leaving it wide open for the providers to do what they think that they should do, and of course their incentive is their bottom line. But I think that we have to look at that, and I think it's important not just for the FCC but also for NECA to have some kind of oversight group. That would be critical to monitoring and watching what the providers are doing, and the NECA to monitor the number of minutes and, the monies that are being paid for those minutes. I don't believe that we want to get into the nitty-gritty, of what kind of calls are being made. That violates consumers' privacy. We do have the right to have that privacy, and we don't want them to monitor that. I don't think it's necessary. I think there's a way to come up with monitoring the minutes of calls. We can look at peaks, and I believe there has to be a way. If we can send a man to the moon, we are able to find a way to do things without, getting into violation of confidentiality and, respecting the privacy of the calls. And rules about the kinds of calls that are being compensated. That would ensure the integrity of the provider if we do so. The providers will have to then comply. And we need to have rules on what kind of calls can be billed to the fund. That is critical. And I think a meeting with the providers, bringing them all together, is a wonderful opportunity for them to know that they need to be on their toes at all times. And there's no opportunity for them to, have arguments and have filing after filing. I think we have to minimize that. The FCC and NECA, they should analyze and aggregate the calls. We should look at the call data, not individual calls. There's no basis of the argument which says, well, we're going to cut the fund. Cutting the compensation, that will encourage more fraud. So I don't want to see you getting into that, getting into cutting the compensation. The rules about what calls can be made can't prevent people from making the types of calls that they want to make. Providers should offer whatever features that they are allowed to offer to their consumers. Every provider that provides the VP equipment can come up with ways of improving their product and let the consumers choose what they want, and that's a wonderful opportunity. I think that the FCC and NECA, once they establish the ground rules, and I think they don't compensate providers for certain calls, like podcast calls. That needs to be clear. Is that a call that can be compensated or not? So that is one example. Hiring more deaf people to call each other, to bring up the costs. Is that allowed, or is that not allowed? Phoning in events, giving incentives to make those calls to, raise money. Is that allowed or not allowed? We need to have the FCC to work harder to have that oversight group to do that monitoring of calls and how VRS operates. We need to go back to the original purpose of VRS. And one thing I would like to mention, you talked about whether we should allow the states to take over VRS and managing that. That's scary to me, because I know that from state to state. For example, I live in North Carolina. I know the state of North Carolina does not have a lot of money, and I would hate to see, well, in North Carolina, we'll have limited VRS services because the money's not there. It's not mandated.
Right, sure.
Whereas in California, they have a worse budget
Right, and we've got
problem.
We're already 20 million in the hole in
Right.
California.
There are plenty of state
Right.
reps who are worrying about this right now, and I don't want to veer into that. That was more of a hypothetical to respond to what Karen was asking about or suggesting about certifying all providers. I don't want to get into the states issue, but what I do, you've raised a lot of meaty points here, and I want to follow up on a couple of them. One thing you said is that cutting compensation, the compensation rate will actually lead to more fraud. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate upon that, and if we could get any responses to that from other panelists.
If there are plans to lower the rates to maintain the budget for the VRS providers, lowering the rates is not going to prevent fraud. So the 3-year tiered rate that we have established seems to be effective. And it seems to have met the needs. People are making calls, and VRS providers are being productive. They're developing better services, answering calls in less than 2 minutes, making better VP products, and they're offering more products and options for the consumers. So the rate part, I think we should keep it the way that it's been for the last 3 years. I think it's worked out well. There was one comment here that talked about the possibility of changing the rate, and would that be, minimizing fraud? I don't think that's the case.
Sherry, did you have a comment in response to that? I see your 10 card up, or?
Yes, I did want to make a comment to that. However, I know Jim's been waiting, so I'd be happy to hold until he has something to say. Actually, because my comment had to do with the discussion about rates that you just had, if you don't mind.
Yes, that's what I'm asking for. And I think Jim has gracefully, and Karen's had her card up for a while also. I wanted to sort of shift to this topic right now. So please go ahead.
Well, thank you. Actually, before we even have a discussion about the rates and whether or not the rate should remain or decrease, maybe it's an American thing. I mean, when you have a business and, should costs go down or go up, generally there's this concept here with any product or service that rates tend to go down. So I would hope in the future that definitely we would actually see the price go down, yes, but we're not yet there. And so, because we really don't know what the actual costs are behind the rate. And that's why I hope that the FCC will be taking a leadership role with OIG's help to, with audits and troubleshooting problem areas, et cetera. Because, again, I'm afraid we're worrying about these big things, but yet there are hidden areas we've not even foreseen yet. And those hidden areas may be where the big problem is. For example, certification. I mean, later I know we're probably going to talk about certification issues. There are a lot of things that you could require in the initial certification and therefore be more stringent in who you give certification to and have an agreement about what the FCC expects from them, have clear-cut policies, including the prices that they can incur, and have that from the get-go. And grandfather in only those companies who can show what their actual costs are. Of course, actual costs and that 25% percent overhead that you put on top of it. I mean, again, I'm a consumer advocate. I can't argue whether or not that cost is accurate or okay or not, but I'm just speaking generally. I would like to say that, of course, I mean, the prices should drop it. I mean, everyone in this room knows this. Eventually, the rate is going to have to drop.
Okay, you know what, I do want to talk about rate issues. I was hoping you would talk more about the relationship between rates and fraud. Do you have any more commentary on that, or were you more focused on the actual rates issue itself? Because if so, I'd like to move on. Claude.
This is Greg, actually. Can I add one quick comment? Oops.
Yes. Do you want to specifically talk about the relationship between rate and fraud? Then we can discuss the compensation rate, that issue later. Is that where you want to go?
Right.
This is Greg. Can I make a real quick comment in support of what Mike had just said? The relationship between rate and fraud and then certification. If you don't mind, just give you a couple of brief facts. The FCC has been receiving applications for certification since we first offered that ability in December of 2005. We have received a number of applications. Almost all of the applications are to be a VRS provider, not IP relay providers. There have been a couple, but the overwhelming majority of companies want to get into the VRS company market, and to me, that's very telling.
Nice.
Well, and that's fine. That's fine.
This is Greg Rosston.
Yeah. Why don't we, Dr. Wilson, why don't you go ahead, please?
Just as a matter of economics, it's not clear. That lowering the rate is clearly not a silver bullet. There are ideas that go both directions, whether you'd have more fraud or not. One thing was, the rate has been coming down over time, and it wasn't the case that there was much more fraud. At least I don't think that you could say, when the rate was higher, there was more fraud, and reducing the rate has reduced fraud. So that's sort of an empirical piece of evidence that this is not going to be the silver bullet to cure it. But it's also the case that there is less of a profit margin if you do reduce the rates, but you also you have many other effects if you do reduce the rate. If you reduced it to zero, you'd have zero fraud. That's pretty clear, but that's probably not the right answer for getting service to customers, because you would have no one providing service either.
Okay. Karen's been waiting patiently. Let me comment.
You asked some questions before, and they haven't been answered. Can I answer those first? Or do you want me to come? Okay. Very quickly, you asked, how does blogs jive with whistleblowing? I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it can be both. You can have a private whistleblowing program where people are allowed to come in confidentiality. You could also have a very public, transparent blog where people can post their thoughts about what's going on in the industry. You asked about what to do if it takes several days to implement a new policy. Having worked here, I understand that. I could respect that, but there are some practices that are so blatantly and obviously illegal that they can be struck overnight. And when I worked here in the Consumer Bureau, sometimes things would come through the consumer inquiries and complaints section of the Bureau, and very often overnight a public notice or a public alert would go out saying this practice is prohibited. So there are going to be some things that are obvious, and you can nip those in the bud right away. I don't think it's been a matter of not having several days. I think that frankly it's been months and sometimes years before a practice has ceased. I mean, in the past, many years ago, there was a practice by one provider of requiring a certain number of minutes in order for people to keep their equipment. It took about a year to get that shut down. One other suggestion that I actually just thought of sitting here is one thing that would be very, very helpful is to reach out beyond the consumer organizations. The groups sitting here are very in tune to what is happening, but the users themselves are not. And they mostly get their information from the providers. And I think it's important for them to start getting their information directly from the FCC. Sherry, can you get Sherry? I want to make sure that you hear what I'm suggesting, because I want to know if you agree with this. What I'm saying is that I think that it's important for the consumers to get their information more directly from the FCC on a regular basis. One of the things that that CGB used to have was a listserv where people with disabilities signed up, kind of like, you know, RSS feed or just some kind of way of getting periodic information directly from the FCC. You could have thousands of consumers across the country sign up to get regular emails or tweets or blog information. I mean, you could even have your own Facebook page, but you could have a way of getting your information directly to them. And so when you see a practice occurring that you know should not be occurring, you send out that same public alert to consumers, and they get it immediately. Most of these consumers have computers. So, I mean, that's something that could be done very easily. It's free, and yet the consumers are getting the information directly from the FCC rather than from the groups. As far as the rate goes, just really quickly, I guess my feeling about it is that part of the problem with what's gone on with the rate is, again, that it hasn't been transparent, that there's no clarity as to what it's covering. The rate proceedings have kind of grasped out of thin air what the rate should be. I do think that tiers work. There have to be tiers because 80% of the market is provided by one provider. So you're obviously going to have economies of scale with having one provider dominate so much of the market. But at the same time, there's a real question as to whether what the rate is covering. I guess my personal view is that equipment and services be separate.
Okay. Very important points. Let's get to those a little later. Dr. Jayakar.
Michael, you asked earlier about the relationship between the rates and fraud, but my response would be that the rates cannot not go down. They have to go down because we have the total reimbursements from the fund as the product of two factors. One is the number of minutes and the other is the rate. Now, the minutes are on an upward trajectory and they're not coming down. If you look at the data, you see almost an exponential curve. Now, broadband penetration is increasing, minutes are going to go up. Now, that means that if the program has to be sustainable politically, it has to be at the expense of rates. The rates have to come down. Now, it could be because of economies of scale. Now, the whole idea behind having 3 tiers is that there are economies of scale, and so it supports the model that the FCC is implementing, that rates should come down with increasing scale. Otherwise, we'll have a situation that prevailed in universal service a few years back in 2003. There were acts introduced in Congress saying that the whole program has to be wound up because it was beginning to cost too much. So that's the trade-off. Do you want to protect the sustainability and viability of the program by controlling the cost, or do you want the cost to escalate and it become a political problem?
Thank you. Rosaline?
Thank you. And I echo the calls here for transparency in the entire rate setting process. It's been very frustrating for us as consumer groups to provide any kind of really informed input into the process because we're shut out completely. We can just suggest certain categories of reasonable expenses be covered, reasonable costs of research and development, marketing and outreach that we think should be covered, but I'm not even sure what's in the rates or what is or is not being covered and what's considered reasonable and the whole thing. So much greater transparency is absolutely necessary. The question about rates and fraud, why is there fraud? What's the motive? I mean, there are people that will steal. There's no question in my mind that human beings will steal, and given the opportunity, the temptation is greater, and the probability is increased as well. But I'd be very interested to know, of the fraud that is being perpetrated. It's like the fraud in the indictments. Is the fraud and the manufacturing of minutes for reimbursement motivated by greed, on lining pockets, or is it motivated by a provider or providers who have gotten themselves so dug in a hole because of the investment to get into the market and the barriers to actually accessing the market, you know, that they just needed the manufactured minutes to quote-unquote survive. You know, so I'm not, whatever the motive is, you know, I'm not sure that the rate, whether, you know, is really going to, you know, those situations happen all the time, the human tendency to steal if the opportunity presents itself, and the human tendency to dig oneself out of the hole, you know, even if it's not ethical to the way you're going about it. I'm just you know, I just don't know that those things are ever going to go away, and because we have these tendencies, regardless of what the rate is, humans will be humans, and greed will be greed, and people will be creative in how they go about defrauding anybody. So you know, I don't think we can set a rule and say these are the rules and that's the bright line that you can't cross, because people do get creative, and we're going to have to keep coming back and looking at this again and again and again, and we're going to have to be vigilant, and we're going to have to monitor, and we're going to have to be responsive, you know, to questions about what's appropriate and what's not.
I'd like to follow up quickly on, Rosaline, on your comment about the reason folks might do these certain things in order to survive, let's say, a question of survivability. That has to do with illegitimate calls, et cetera, manufactured minutes. However, there is another area that I'm hearing that the argument should, the rate should stay at a specific cost so that providers can survive. So are you saying that's then not a good argument? If you reduce the rate, then some other companies, some providers will be killed off? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Claude, we'll get to you in a minute. I think Greg asked Rosaline a direct question, so we'll give her the chance to respond.
And I was very happy. This is Rosaline. I was very happy for Claude to respond to that. And again, I mean, how can you ask me about whether the rate is too high or too low, or is it reasonable, when I don't have access to the information? And so trying to make a judgment call about whether lowering the rate will increase or decrease fraud is a question I can't answer. I don't have access to the data.
Okay. Claude.
Okay. Let me make one statement clear. There is no relationship between the rate and fraud whatsoever, period. Now, in your everyday life, you drive a car and you see what the speed limit is, and it's 60, and you are praying that you're not going to get caught because you're driving 65 or 70. Now, recently we've seen indictments in the VRS industry. They were hoping not to get caught. The FCC obviously had evidence. And if the evidence is true and the court actually finds them to be guilty, that's what will happen. However, that needs to be separate from this discussion. In the future, you've got to figure out how to reduce this illegal behavior. Now, the correlation between rate and fraud is not there. That's insulting to those providers who very specifically are trying to do their good work every day and earn their $6 some odd cents per minute to do their VRS work. They need to be respected. The FCC, and I'm sure, didn't say, wow, it's going to be 6 something and hope there's no fraud. That's not what you did. The providers have chosen, some I should say, have chosen to do things and cross their fingers that they could make that quick buck and not get caught. So please keep that thought in mind. Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion about the rate. It is, however, important that the FCC keep in mind from now on that, as others have said, keep this, it's important that providers have, how do I say this, fair compensation in proportion to what their operational costs are, the number of minutes, etc. The tier structure works well. However, providers need, when you meet with the FCC, need to say actually what your costs are and what it costs you expect to be covered. Sometimes the FCC has a different view than you do, because the FCC will say, oh no, that's too much in that area, you really want to have that much in outreach and marketing, etc. And the providers say, oh no, that's very important. the FCC would need to have data to justify what you're saying, that you need X amount more for outreach and data. Because then you could see, for example, providers need to tell the FCC that they're going to do certain things to get more hearing people involved in the service and use of the service. The FCC is going to come back at you. You need to come back with them and get your, quote, dollar for dollar impact. Or go to Congress, because Congress is going to be asking the FCC if they are maintaining the integrity of the fund. That is the Commission's responsibility. Please do not forget consumers in this process, however. Consumers have levels of expectations as well that may be different from yours. We want to know what we're getting. We want to see our technology improve over time. I don't want to be stalled in the technology that I have. I want to keep up with everyone else, my neighbors, and whatever their cell phones have, whatever cell phones they have, and whatever computers they have. I don't want to be stuck with my current video phone in a, quote, closed system. I want you as providers to work with whatever's out there, whatever mainstream video product is out there on the market, and get it to us. And if you want to do your own video phone, that's great. Make sure, however, that it is compatible with those ones out there on the shelf. So the rate, I think, needs to take all of those issues into account. And when you arrive at a rate, make sure that that meets consumer expectations first, then compensate providers fairly, and then make sure they're following the FCC regulations.
Okay, I think we have inevitably started to drift into issues about what this service will look like going forward, how the rates should be structured. Before we continue and move squarely into those issues, I just wanted to come back to one thing to see if anyone had any further comment. This is about the certification process. A few of the panelists raised some issues about that. I'm just wondering if there's any further comment about what certification. What should be required in the certification process, any comments on white label providers, what sort of disclosures there should be, things along those lines. Sharon, why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you. I think that that's okay. I'm sorry to the interpreter for having my tent card in front of myself. All right, really, I think that, Mike, that question makes much more sense to me. To see, that has much more of a relationship to the rate, actually, certification, than the fraud. I see much more of a tie between rate and certification than rate and fraud. What's really important to keep in mind, and it really reinforces all of the points that have been made by Claude, Rosaline, and Karen about the rate, is that the rate is an incentive. And Michael, you walk into, a telephone store. I'm really jealous of you, by the way, of your ability to do that. My kids can go into whatever phone store they want, and I'm jealous because they have Nokia, Samsung, and all these other products available to them on the shelf. They're just walls of products available to them from various companies because the market out there isn't incentive enough. We, as deaf individuals, don't have that type of access because phone companies will just not include us in the design, and that's why the FCC has various programs in place to not, specifically even to make sure with VRS, to not forget that we too need functional equivalency because we've never really had that before. So the blessing is honestly to thank you for having a rate out there that provides an incentive for people to provide service to us. We want to get stuck with 1 or 2 or even 5 providers. Right now we have more than 10, and that's wonderful. I want to be able down the road to go into, quote, the phone store and see walls and walls and walls of video phones for deaf individuals. And that ties into the certification question. With the rate, we honestly, consumers just want to see stricter rules, oversight on tied with the certification process. Karen, Rosaline, you did a much better explanation on this than I ever could, but the bottom line is that if the certification process is stricter and tougher, then the FCC, because really only the FCC, not states, only the FCC can control who would be a certified VRS provider. You then have more control and more oversight.
Sharon?
Thank you. In talking about certification, we see many issues with providers that are sort of mom and pop entities that are not certified through the FCC. They're often running with their services, but they have no accountability. These mom and pop sort of places or VRS providers. I think that the FCC needs to come up with requirements for those who want to open up as new providers of services for VRS. I mean, I think it's wonderful that there are so many different providers, but there has to be some sort of way of controlling this. You know, the time that it takes for a group to become certified is long enough as it is. I don't know the inner workings of the FCC as much as, you know, most of you might. You know, I stay at home, watch TV, go out, travel. I do my own thing. So I don't have a great understanding of the inner workings here. But from a consumer's perspective, there has to be more strict guidelines. And also guidelines for new incoming providers who are affiliated with other providers and then in turn are getting reimbursement. Where is that accountability for those subcontracted providers? Is it on the certified provider to govern that because they've then decided to take on that subcontractor? I think that there needs to be an accountability in place for subcontractors so that they can apply and then hopefully become certified by the FCC. That's something that we could see in the future.
This is Greg in response to the certification. I'd like to follow up actually with something that Sherry said. It's interesting to see your explanation of the correlation between certification and the rate and what's going on in the marketplace. There are more certified. Do you think that more certified providers out there will bring more products into the market? I think that's what you've said, and I find that to be an interesting concept. And the FCC also, often in several orders, has stated that rates do not cover equipment. That any costs of equipment are not compensable from the fund as part of the rate. So, if I understand correctly, are you saying that if we were to certify more providers, that would actually bring more products to the market, and then you would get to the point, or that would actually be part of, I should say, the eligibility criteria, that they should be able to show to us the value that they could bring to the market before we would then certify them? Is that what your argument is? What do you mean, I'm sorry, value? Greg's clarified. What I mean is that right now we have obviously many providers and then subcontractors and then contractors to the subcontractors, and we have numerous numbers of white label companies. So should we be asking them what can they bring to the market before we would consider certifying them? Should we also require certified providers actually own a center and operate a center before they are certified? Should we require them to be a certified common carrier? Would that mean that foreign-based companies could then offer VRS services as well?
Thank you for speaking to that. I know that I've been inundated with different comments that speak to that.
This becomes an opportunity for deaf-owned businesses to potentially participate in the market and potentially become certified. Maybe the criteria for certification should, let's see, for example, what we might want is how many deaf employees work for that company? Are there more than 50%? Because that's what there should be for certification. Is the CEO deaf? Who's the board of directors? How many deaf individuals are on the board? Is it deaf run, basically? What's the management look like? Is this run by and for the deaf? I think that's what they should look like. And preference points, I should say, should be given to individuals who meet, or entities that meet those criteria, because they would bring value to the community, because we are then part of their business, so to speak. So we want to see that type of support. Did you want? I had one quick point about provisional certification. Ed Bassan and I have spoken about this. There are many consumers who don't like the white label program. Some do, many don't. Instead, just one idea is the concept of a provisional certificate. So like, when you go to a bank and try to get a small business loan, generally there's a 5-year max on that. And the basic concept is within that, that period of time, you will be up there and running, and you will own your own center type of thing. Or maybe within 4 or 5 years, you will have your own call center in operation. And so if you provide an entity with this provisional certificate, if they don't meet those criteria after a certain period of time, they're out of there. I mean, there are many types of ideas that the FCC could potentially come up with as a ad hoc, using an ad hoc committee.
Claude?
The FCC needs to give all VRS providers national certification. I think that will then do away with getting VRS providers through a state or anything like that. The FCC needs to operate under much stricter criteria. Any company that wants to provide VRS, you should know that, for example, if they go to the bank and say, I want to borrow money, I want to borrow, I don't know, X million dollars or thousands of dollars of money, you know that the bank is going to say, well, what's your business plan? If that company has a business plan and can potentially get through with the bank, that should then be part of your certification criteria. The FCC, before the FCC accepts any, whether it's a large provider or, well, using the term white label provider, because they would, I think, have to go through your national certification as well, not necessarily be affiliated with a certified provider, you should ask them to see their business plan. And then based on that, you can make a decision whether or not you should certify them or not. You should have a very clear criteria that is fair to all entities who would apply for certification.
Rosaline?
Thank you. And I agree with the other comments here, and especially about the FCC certification. I think it's become necessary at this point, and anyone who is not currently certified by the FCC should have certainly a reasonable amount of time to go through that process. I have not seen a whole lot of applications for certification, but the ones that I have seen are slim to none in terms of amount of information that's actually contained in. Seems just like a whole bunch of promises that, yes, I will follow the rules, and yes, I will meet the standards, and yes, I promise to do this, without any real substance. And I think it's the substance that's lacking that needs to be addressed. We did file comments on this issue of white label and other providers and certification. There was I think the commission teed up the questions in a rulemaking process back in March. I don't know, in light of recent indictments and issues, whether or not it might be appropriate to supplement that the record on that, because I think one of the questions about accountability has been teed up and probably does need to be discussed in terms of the legal and other questions, and the privity between businesses and all the good legal stuff. And I'm sure there'll be lots of legal people who can provide input into that. But I think that accountability really does need to be addressed, regardless of who's ultimately responsible. Somebody has to be accountable, and I think every single one of them need to be accountable, regardless of who's ultimately liable or responsible. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosaline. I just wanted to just touch on one procedural thing that Rosaline raised, which is about whether to refresh comments. We certainly invite that, and I meant to actually address this from the get-go, that we are accepting ex parte comments in this docket. It's CG 03123. We are happy to get any submissions on the record from any interested party on any of the topics that we're discussing today. So thank you for raising that. Dr. Jayakar.
Just wanted to add a comment to the certification process. I do see the point behind certifying more providers, and that increases choice and brings more products and services to market. That's all very good. But one of the consequences of broadening the set of providers would be to fragment the market, basically, and increase the percentage of overall conversation minutes that are compensated at peak rate under the three-tier system. And which brings me to a comment about the tiered system itself. One of the purposes of increasing competition is to make firms more efficient and lower costs for consumers. But in this case, because all companies are compensated at cost, that benefit is not being realized because the tiered structure and competition are sort of incompatible.
Can I jump in?
Oh, yes. Go ahead, Dr. Ross.
So I think, having looked at the economics of the industry, there are some economies of scale, but again, as I said at the start, the biggest cost is interpreter time. And no matter whether you're Sorensen or a small startup, for every conversation minute, you need to have an interpreter. And that doesn't change. Sorensen is able to, because of queuing efficiencies, able to get some efficiencies on that, but it's not nearly as big as it might seem. And I think what we want to do is to try to make sure that you have an incentive for firms. This three-tiered rate structure may be the right thing, may not be, but making sure that you have sort of a price cap that gives firms the incentive to reduce costs is good. And then the users have an incentive to pick the highest quality one. The government is the customer who pays and wants to push down the costs. I agree with that. But I think it's important also to understand that consumers pick the quality and the government then tries to minimize the costs given the quality.
Thank you. I think this is a good time to segue to a next topic. We're starting to talk a lot about competition, what the nature of competition is in this service. I was trying to talk about rates. I think a fundamental question that should be addressed, though, and we've also heard some negative feedback to this idea, is what should VRS look like in the future? Should it remain a competitive service? Should it be competitively bid out? If the latter, would that be on a national basis, on a regional basis? We'd like to hear both some of the economics arguments as well as consumer views on that. Rosaline, why don't you go ahead? You raised your 10 card very emphatically.
But I think Claude beat me out. But nonetheless, I'll go ahead. I just wanted to say that I think we are emphatically and resoundingly opposed to competitive bids in this stage at this time. I say that because we believe that there are significant benefits to the competition that we have seen already happen in this industry. The variety, the ability for consumers to actually choose, the competition that fosters innovation and development of new products. We have actually started to see that. I think we're actually just, however, at the beginning of that. And to do anything that might slow that progress, I think, would actually be a huge backstep for all of us. I also think that the current VRS market with a single dominant provider and a bunch of other little providers kind of, trying to, get a piece of whatever's left over is not an equal it's not an equal playing field at all, and I just think that it just wouldn't be amenable to a competitive bid process at all. And I think we also have to look at the very common undesirable results of competitive bidding that we experienced already in the state programs, and we've experienced them routinely in other parts of our lives. That you go to competitive bid, you're looking at lowest price, and what you end up is lowest quality. And what you end up with is a set of standards that are absolutely minimum, and that's exactly what you get. There's no incentive to do any more because that's all you've been asked to do. So we are absolutely against any concept of competitive bidding at this time. Perhaps in the future, when the market changes, when, you know, things change, but on the current environment, no.
Claude?
I'm speaking from my experience as the former state relay administrator in North Carolina. If the FCC falls into a competitive bidding situation, I think it's going to do more harm than help. You will be selecting one or a number of providers more based on cost, and we will end up getting the lowest cost provider, and that provider will probably be happy to continue with their contract with you, but provide the minimum level of service. You're better off having competitive service where all possible providers can line up, so to speak, and make sure, and you can make sure that they all are nationally certified. In that regard, you will have better services, consumers will have choice, and it will not be based on necessarily what you're paying, because they would then be on a similar level playing field. They would have to compete for our business. They would be competing on who can get more minutes than the others, and consumers as a result will experience more choices and realize that they like this provider better than that provider, and consumers want to participate in a healthy, competitive market. You have choices and with your cars. You have choices with what computers you buy. We as a deaf consumer want to have our choice, and we have a right to that in relay services. One more thing I would like to emphasize is if we go back to when the ADA was passed in 1990, Congress pretty much left everything to the FCC, and the FCC was to ask the states, go ahead and do your own bidding process within your own state. And back in that time, the FCC allowed states to determine who they would choose to be their one TRS provider, which is all that there was back in that day. It didn't work so well because in whatever state I'm in, I'm stuck with one provider. My choices are limited. I am limited with whoever the state chose. The state may have had different criteria in mind than I did as a consumer. And what I received as a consumer was minimal relay services based on whatever minimal requirements were established in the RFP. Providers never went above and beyond, in general, what those minimal requirements were. We were then punished based on where we lived, because some states had much better services than others. So we want to make sure that VRS is maintained as a nationwide service, so that no matter where we live in America, we can experience the same choices and have a variety of choices amongst the various providers. We really, that's very, very, very important to us.
Okay, thank you. I mean, competition definitely improves services. In the hearing world, you see that happen, and VRS could do that as well. We're trying to see that happen. We're waiting for the time to make it occur. We're trying to make sure that our wait times come down and that the contracts can demand higher rates. And then the contract will also, you know, take on their own incentive to go ahead and make the changes to the contract. And I think that that's important to have competition, just like the hearing world. In the past, I'd say like in the 1980s, and I haven't there was some of the research that was done on the internet based on the phone services and some of the history available to that. But in the 1980s, they made AT&T break up, and that didn't help. And so that's something that we see when we're talking about providers and providing competition, that it is a healthy concept, that we have competition between the providers and that we need to have that as well. And it's also going to be seeing a lot of benefit from the national providers if we provide that. We've already had several providers that the system brought us that provided better service, better equipment, better technology, and I think that we need to try to keep up with that.
You record it.
Okay, it's official. I've been awake for 24 hours now. I'm starting to phase out. Okay. The question was
contracting out. Okay.
Competition, right? Okay. I think definitely, for the record, I want to emphasize what Rosaline was saying, what all the other panelists have already echoed, that the consumer feedback is what I'm bringing here to the table, and what I'm hearing is that they are not opposed to the competitive process, that they are opposed to the competitive process, the bidding process. With many different services, as I mentioned before, they enjoy how incentives have established and what we would like to see in the future for VRS, what we'd like to see happening. And it was my vision, and so please don't shoot me because this is just mine. But if you remember, I told you about the phone store, that I want someday to be able to go into a phone store and, have a say like a Sprint store, for example, and just be able to see there on the racks some kind of cell phone that has the video capability as well as captioning capability that will allow me to sign, or will allow a hard of hearing person to buy the phone in the store. Equivalently, as though they were a hearing person, to go in and buy a product. So that I can just go in and buy the phone myself, with the understanding, and I'm saying the important concept here is that I'm buying it. It's not the FCC buying it. That, we have deaf and hard of hearing people who have already bought some of the technologies that are out there, but when we talk on issues of economy of scale, I think that seems to be the hot buzz word here today. The point is that in the future, VRS, the hope that we have is that it will become affordable, and that we could incentivize those businesses to get involved in the industry so that we could have more deaf and hard of hearing people in that workforce as well, so it could be deaf owned and deaf run. We want to see more of that going into the VRS business services to try and improve over time the quality of services, so that in the future we can ourselves basically say we don't want to have the government controlling the VRS, that we are going to be able to go into a store and buy some kind of video phone product on our own.
Okay,
This
Rosaline?
is Greg Rosston.
All right, let's get Dr. Rosston.
So I think that you talk about sort of the nature of competition, and competition in VRS has really taken form of competition in two respects. One is in terms of quality, with the reduction in hold times and training of interpreters and the change in equipment. And the second aspect where competition has come in has been in increasing access. The vast increase in the number of people with video phones that are capable of using VRS has been phenomenal over the last 5 years, because the companies have had the incentive to, even though it's not compensated, provide users with video phones. If you were to change to go to a bidding competitive bidding situation, that would change the nature of competition in the industry. It may be good, it may be bad. I am not at all surprised that the people who are speaking on behalf of VRS users don't want competition because don't want competitive bidding for this, because they benefit substantially from this quality competition and right now are not paying anything for the service directly. So if someone told me, well, you don't pay anything for it, but you get better quality, I'd be happy. And if they start competing on doing competitive bidding and the quality goes down, I'd be unhappy. It changes the quality but doesn't change my price. So that piece of it is not surprising. I think there are ways to ensure prices keep decreasing, like in price caps. The experience of price caps where you set a price cap with a productivity enhancement over time is been a very good way of regulating for local telephony, and it has reduced the real price of telephone service, and it still does require monitoring of quality. But I think that's the kind of thing you need to think about, is who's paying, who benefits from the competition, and where does the government want? Do they want to focus now on cost as opposed to focusing on quality and access? And if so, there are ways to do that. If you want to keep focusing on quality and access, then you would use different mechanisms for the competition.
Thank you. Rosaline?
Thank you. I just wanted to remind you that, and perhaps this will be a prelude to a question, that this question was raised in 2006, the last time we did the rate proceeding, and comments were submitted on this question, this very question at that time, and it was virtually unanimously, all the commenters were opposed, basically, the competitive bid methodology at that time. I don't know that anything has significantly changed between 2006 and today, or whether you think something has changed that has triggered this question, or whether you're just testing the waters again just to see if the temperature has changed. So I'm perhaps a little bit confused as to why this has come up at this time again, and what actually has changed between 2006, 2007, and today. The other thing I wanted to kind of mention is the fact that when I think of competitive bid systems, I think of systems where I have many providers of the product that I'm seeking, and these providers are not single product providers. These are people who have lots of different services, they serve lots of different customers, they have lots of different products, and there's lots of different buyers for their products. And in this particular industry right now, what you're looking at is a very limited, quite frankly, it is very limited number of providers who are providing, for the most part, a single product. And you have only one buyer, and that is the FCC. And if the FCC, the single buyer, decided to do a competitive bid market, it would basically, depending on how many people it led into the, accepted for bids, it would basically put out of business everybody else in the market. And then when you're talking about trying to have competition that fosters innovation and improves quality of service and stuff like, you have eliminated the competition entirely, wiped it off the map, and there is really no possibility of any kind of competitive edge here, and you will end up with a coercive monopoly. And the person who's got the biggest, who's got your bid, is the one who's going to be, telling you what prices you have to, set, because it's going to be the tail wagging the dog if you go down that route in this current set of circumstances for this industry today.
To what you just said, you raised a good point. This is not my personal view at all. This is something that does need to be raised. There is an argument out there that, for example, if there's a contracted out service, one benefit is that the commission would have better tools for auditing, as well as better oversight and better control, let's say, over the program. these contractors would be subject to the terms and the conditions in the contract, things that are in black and white. That is a potential advantage. Also, there's an argument about the competitive bidding that, I mean, I understand your points that you've just made, that you don't want to eliminate the incentive to actually compete for a better quality of service. What would your thoughts be if there were a competitive bidding process that would then, let's say, maybe 5 providers would be granted the contract? It's not one, but let's say I'm just hypothetically picking 5 providers. Would that potentially provide competition?
I don't even, this is Rosaline again, I don't even want to entertain that kind of hypothetical question because I just don't think it's appropriate in this particular stage of this particular industry and market. We have very limited.
Well, this question, specifically, it was in what we provided to you, and it does mention multiple providers.
That's correct, and I don't even think if you limit it, if you had, 5 or 6 or 7, the market itself only has what, 10 or 12, and I am convinced emphatically that competitive bids will not work even if you chose 5.
I think Sherry was waiting.
Okay, Sharon.
I want to reinforce what Mr. Rosston's point was. And I also, and I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, Jayakar, I can't see it from quite so far away, but also the point that you were making in terms of what this is going to look like with competitive service and competitive bidding being different concepts. With competitive bidding, one of the things that we know about, because we've seen it happening heretofore in the TRS world, is, I'm so bad about putting my tent card down. With competitive bidding, what we have seen is indeed a reduction down to 1 or 2 options, and that being the limit. And so I am strongly adamant, and I'll protest if I have to on this issue, but I do not want to see that we are going to get stuck with limited options. If we want to make criterion, we could say that the FCC can set up criteria related to saying that deaf have to be hired, they have to be employed with the company at the rate of more than 50% of the company population. They have to offer certifications for those deaf-owned, run, and operated companies, and only those. I'm not sure if the FCC could actually answer demands such as that, but we would love to see something like that, or try to provide that opportunity within the marketplace so that we could have lots of companies, and not just 1 or 2. We're not interested in seeing a monopoly happen, and that's basically the point that I wanted to make. We don't want monopolies.
Thank you. Karen.
Greg, in answer to your question, I'm not sure that I see that there's much difference in having entities contract with the federal government versus what is now. I think that these are federally operated programs, and any company that's providing these services needs to be complying with the laws and policies that the FCC sets. And I think that one thing that would help also in achieving compliance is to put all of the little pieces of information that you've provided in public notices into the rules themselves. That's another thing that we didn't mention before, but many of these policies have not been codified in your rules. Once they're in the rules, and actually even technically now when they're in the orders, any company providing services has to comply with them. I don't think that a contract's going to make that much of a difference. People can violate contracts as well. One other, I wanted to comment on what you mentioned, Krishna, in terms of fragmenting the market. One other way of going about this is potentially, yes, it's true that startups and smaller companies are going to be getting the higher rate. And one possibility is to have startups be able to do that to enhance competition, but to have some expectation that they would achieve a certain level of efficiency or meet the criteria that Sherry's talking about and that Claude's talking about, have a business plan, and that they'd be expected by a certain time to reach a certain as I say, level of effectiveness, efficiency, and completion of that business plan. You know, and that way it would be a way to, I guess, weed out programs that are just kind of fly-by-night programs that just wanted to get certified or get the money from the government and didn't really have a concrete operational infrastructure with which it could go forward.
All right, Claude, why don't you go ahead and then.
Thank you, Mike. It's important that consumer groups not see the FCC pick, for example, the number 5 in terms of competition. We want to see as many providers as we can get. And I think you had said VRS has been in business for 10 years, Greg, is that what you said in your opening remarks? And so it's been 10 years from the pilot until now, or no, from the time that the FCC approved VRS as a compensable service. Okay, wow, I thought it was only 4 or 5 years. I can't believe it's actually been 10 years. Well, you know, back in the day, we started with 2 or 3 providers, and now we've seen that number grow. And some of those providers started as small little entities, and they are not so small anymore. For example, HOVRS has now become purple. We need to preserve that climate, right, and not have only one company. As consumers, we really, really cherish that, so please keep that in mind.
Okay, Dr. Jayakar.
Okay, I'm repeating myself here, but to go back to a point that came up some time back, the point I wanted to make was that competitive entry and ad cost reimbursement do not go together. So if you're going to permit competitive entry, you need to put some other form of compensation in place, such as maybe a price cap, so that if you can index the price cap to inflation and the productivity improvement, over time the prices would come down. So the fund could be controlled, the size of the fund could be controlled. Otherwise, you get more entry, but you don't get the rewards of entry in terms of better efficiency or lowering the cost.
Thank you. Sharon?
I wanted to talk about new company providers as they are coming up in the market. You know, like when you go as a teenager to apply for a driver's license, you're not automatically licensed right away. You get a 1-year provisional license, and you have that opportunity to show that you can actually do the driving. And you'll get the real certification later. You'll get that official licensure later after you've had a year of practice with mom and dad hanging over your shoulder watching you. And I think that that concept can be applied to the new, as you say, fly-by-night mom and pop shops that are out there providing services and they want to start up a business. They could be given some kind of new provisional certification, and they could be held accountable based on that certification with whoever it is that they are affiliated with to provide the oversight of their management and the way they've set their rules up within their company. And I think that should be a good way to try and encourage those small startup companies to be started up and to grow within the market, and we can use that provisional certification. And at the end of a year, if they have effectively followed the plan, they show that they have developed and grown their business, then I think that they should get their official certification at that point from the FCC. And so I just wanted to mention that. One other example that I wanted to share with you from the fellow on the phone, Rosston, right, thank you for letting me know his name. You had mentioned HOVRS starting as a smaller company and growing larger to what is now purple. We have a comparable example where on the reverse end, where CSD started out and they worked with Sprint as a contractor, and then we saw the VRS portion of that company being branched off. Which is kind of like the old Mama Bell that got separated out as well into the smaller Baby Bell companies. And I think that we see that exact same kind of thing happening with CSD VRS, where it became Z. VRS, and it's kind of a unique thing that's happening. But it's nice to see that something that's happening in the hearing world can happen on a comparable level in our environment as well. So it seems as though we may be getting there a little bit within those natural market influences, and it's nice to see that consumer experience occurring.
Okay, thank you. I think we've heard a lot about the issue of competitive bidding versus a competitive service. Why don't we focus now a little more on, let's just assume the commission does not go with competitive bidding, but rather stays with the multi-provider model. What should the rates, what should the costs be based on? Should they be based on actual costs, projected costs, something else, some sort of hybrid? Dr. Jayakar.
My comment is about the overhead and marketing expenses that are included in the compensation. Now, this is currently allocated on a per minute basis, and there seems to be an inherent conflict there between rewarding companies for raising the call volume and not for the purpose for which that fund is supposed to be used. Marketing is supposed to inform new consumers about the products and services they offer, and to recruit new consumers into the market. But if you compensate on the number of minutes that they generate, that's a skewed incentive altogether, because now they can generate the same or more volume of minutes from the same number of users. So that needs to be changed. I've got a couple of things to propose. First one is, don't compensate based upon outreach and marketing at all. Take that money, put it into a special fund, give it to NACA, and let them do the advertising on behalf of the entire industry. That money could be used for advertising, direct mail to consumers, deaf consumers, and it would not be allocated to the providers themselves. The second proposal would be to let them have the money, but change the way the money is allocated, not on a per minute basis, but on new subscriber generation. So every time they can sign up a new subscriber, they get the money on a pro rata basis.
Thank you. I heard something coming over the PA earlier. Did you have a comment, Dr. Rosston? Or?
Well, that was the operator saying to push in buttons to continue the conversation, but I'd be happy to comment as well.
Well, I guess while you have the floor, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So I think that one of the things to think about is how regulation has worked, and regulation has moved away from rate of return regulation towards price cap regulation to provide firms with incentives to reduce their costs. And to me, that seems to have been a very successful move in regulation. And what my concern has been about the VRS is setting a rate and then revisiting it relatively frequently. If you revisit price caps every year or two, that becomes essentially a rate of return process as opposed to a price cap process. And the benefits of having the price cap process to drive efficiency go away when you move towards rate of return. It sort of sucks away the incentives to be more efficient because you know you're going to have your costs reimbursed. If you could do a price cap proceeding where you could commit to a declining rate over the next 3 to 5 years, and possibly aggressively declining rate, then the firms would know, here's the nut that I have to push past. And you could also get it so that it's that the rates, there's not this big difference between the tiers, so that you get these small firms that would enter if they're going to be efficient within a year. That would be a good way of doing it. You want to get people to have the right incentives. So looking at their costs, if you're going to do something that does cost, you do need to take account of all of the reasonable costs of providing the service. In my mind, that includes the capital cost of the VRS equipment as well as the big cost of the interpreters.
Thank you. Rosaline?
This is Rosaline. I think that we still need to make sure that providers certainly are permitted to market. And in terms of what's reasonable to be compensated for that effort, I think that's subject to debate, and I think we'll be debating that in the next rate proceeding. In terms of other kinds of marketing, that I think the suggestion was to take that marketing money, big pot of marketing money, and give it to NECA. Well, you know what? I think I'd like to have it instead. I think that there is a desperate need, I mean desperate, desperate, desperate need, a void, if you will, of nationwide information, education, and outreach to the broader American public about what the heck is relay. And today we have so many different flavors to choose from and providers to choose from that I think that hearing people are probably getting more and more confused every single day, and they don't know what the heck is going on. And we see a lot of rejection of relay calls, which has to stop. And we have to increase the confidence in relay, and to do that in part is to educate people. I happen to be of the persuasion that somebody else needs to, besides, I love the providers, but besides the providers, somebody needs to do some not brand specific, some what I call neutral marketing, not only to the broader American public, but also to consumers. Consumers are getting their information piecemeal. A little bit here, a little bit there. They're not sure, can it put it together? It'd be really nice if we had some consolidated information. Now, the FCC could do this, the Commission could do this, but the Commission could also authorize some portion of the TRS fund to be allocated for this purpose and provide those funds under grants or contract with neutral, national, consumer, nonprofits. We're not, you know, and let us do it. Let us take the reins. Let us speak for consumers. Let us lead that effort, and let us educate both our communities as well as the broader American public.
Thank you. Claude? Okay, I guess you did address your point. Why don't we let Dr. Jayakar?
I would be completely in agreement with that. When I proposed NECA, I did not mean that I wanted to give the money to industry, but if it's a consumer group who's willing to take up that task, that is even better.
Thank you. Claude?
National or, I don't know, what do you want to call it, generic marketing program, I have no problem with that. I could envision like a public service announcement on television, because senior citizens would probably say, wow, I think that service could meet my needs, like caption telephone. Wow, maybe I should try that. Who do I contact? And then they could contact all the providers out there and make their decision. I could definitely see benefits in that concept. However, often the general public doesn't really get neutral information, which is a whole nother issue. I strongly support branded outreach. I think providers should market their service so that as a consumer I can know what various providers offer. And I want to keep that. You know, at Time Magazine, for example, I can see all the advertisements out there, so I can know. You know, I can see CSD VRS saying my Z products are better, and then another provider saying no, my products are better. But because that's what everyone else receives, and so I should, as part of the mainstream, receive the same types of advertisements. However, I'm not opposed to a nationwide, more generic program. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Jayakar's comment as well as Dr. Rosston's comment. The FCC needs to work with providers to get their money's worth, so to speak, out of the outreach and marketing portion. And if definitely subscribers might increase, and that would be proof of what they're doing. However, I think that a lot of the advertising that happens right now is to people who already get it. And I think I forget, I mean,
if you need to get consumers involved in this, because we're the ones who know who needs to be talked to. For example, senior citizens. Go to the Senior Citizen Center. Go to a deaf club. Go to a deaf expo event, et cetera, et cetera. But, I mean, providers already have those bases covered. I mean, they should continue to have that responsibility.
Thank you. Jim?
Thanks. I was going to get a lighter to set my tent card on fire in hopes that I would be recognized, but I understand this is a no smoking room. I want to echo what Dr. Jayakar said about, how do you motivate in an outreach program like this? And I think it's by new subscriptions, not by driving minutes up. And I think that's, kind of obvious. And although I won't say anything against consumer organization-driven outreach efforts, I think the Commission would be wise to recognize that there already are awareness programs out there that are funded via other agencies that already have established channels of communication. So it might behoove the Commission to investigate those and identify where there are opportunities to leverage those already existing community accessible technology information programs that are out there. This also might be something that could flow into the Commission's National Broadband Plan. If the goal is to drive broadband subscriptions and adoptions by this user segment, then that might fit into that section in the National Broadband Plan that discusses consumer awareness, consumer adoption, and sustainability.
Thank you. Sherry?
I want to reinforce what everybody's been saying thus far. Related to the outreach and the education piece. I think there's a big void, as was mentioned. And for me, I definitely had a visceral reaction when I heard of the NECA suggestion. But for your information, for the California Coalition for the Deaf, we definitely have designed and established an outreach and education program for consumers, which at that time, I think it was, if I can get assistance from the audience on that, I think it was 25 years ago, that Sprint was the sole provider within the state of California, and we, with Sprint, had a relationship for how we were going to design the whole program in 1 year. And in that year, the call volume, after they hired some deaf and hard of hearing people to go out and do the education and the outreach from the California PUC's perspective, they had town halls, they had receptions, and people came out, and the call volume in 1 year tripled. So that's one idea for how we, and I think, I can't remember exactly how long we had that, maybe 5 years we had that outreach program, maybe 6 years that program continued, but we were able to give the CPC, the California Public Commission, we were able to give it over to them after the program had grown its legs, and it could, we had hearing specialists, we had deaf specialists, we had Japanese specialists involved in the program, deaf blind, and that was all part of the education and outreach program to try to get out to the different segments of the population, the different consumers within the community, to educate, to outreach to them and educate to them about the programs that we offered and who the providers were and all those other various details. That's what we have now, but it was designed by deaf people. And I recommend that the FCC follow the same idea to establish an outreach program, contract with, some of the different community-based organizations that are already out there in the different states, in Hawaii, in Minnesota, in Iowa, if you understand what I'm saying. Get those different organizations involved, contract within the community to try to get the word out so that we can provide that. It's better in person than just through written material.
Thank you. Karen?
I just want to echo what Rosaline and what others have said. We need massive amounts of outreach. When the ADA was first passed in 1990, the Department of Justice took it upon itself to conduct a national outreach program for Titles 1, 2, and 3, and left it to the FCC to do Title 4. The result was some of you may remember this, a very thin pamphlet. It was about 2 pages, and that was it. There was never any national outreach on relay. And for a while, it seemed that things were okay, but I think that we're at a crisis right now. The NAD has handled several cases in the last couple of years dealing with businesses and other entities that are hanging up on people. A lot of this had stemmed from the IP relay fraud. It stems from ignorance. It stems from not understanding the confidentiality issues, privacy that occurs with relay services. It is really incumbent. We've seen the FCC step up to the plate on other issues, including DTV, including broadband, and various other issues. The FCC has ignored this issue in terms of national outreach. And this is 20 years in the asking. This is not new. In terms of marketing, I agree with Claude. I think that providers do need to market their individual products because of all the relay services, there are the most distinctions between providers in VRS. There are different quality in interpreters. There's different quality in answer time. There's lots of different variables, different features. But I do think there needs to be a limit on the amount of money that providers can get back for marketing, and I do think that it should be a cost of doing business. I think that tying it to minutes is an error. It provides incentives to increase those minutes. I also am concerned that actually tying new subscribers to minutes would be problematic as well. I think that's an invitation to also padding minutes. This is not an industry, again, where the consumers pay, so they could be subscribers to multiple providers. In fact, most people do have multiple telephones or multiple video phones. So I think that, I mean, it's clear that branding is needed. It's just a matter of how it would be reimbursed and whether there would be a limit on it.
Thank you. I mean, I'll just comment that, just for thought, that, you know, now with the default provider scheme, perhaps that's one way of distinguishing who the users are subscribed with. But moving on from that, and I see a couple of 10 cards up here, but we spent a lot of time in this section of the discussion focused on outreach and marketing, and there are a lot of other issues here, and our time is short. So I wanted to see if there's any, if anyone had anything to say about actual versus projected costs. Another thing that we've heard emphatically from some of the consumer representatives is that they don't have the data to evaluate the rates, and so I'm wondering what input we could get on what useful data would be there, and how to what useful data would be in that respect. And I'll start with Jim.
Well, I think we're clear that we want to see, you know, the true cost broken down. We want to understand what the inputs here, and Dr. Rosston has said, and I think there's no argument that this is a labor-intensive service, but that's not enough. We need to know a little bit more. We need to know, for example, occupancy rates in the busy hour. We need to understand from a telecom provisioning perspective, very classic telecom engineering and economics, where do those labor rates go? How are they aggregated? Where are the opportunities for economizing? You know, what can be done in maintaining service quality high, but to get the per minute labor rates down? What are the other contributory costs? As we all know, the technology costs, hardware and software and network services, are always coming down quickly. So can that contribute to economizing? And you know, I just think we need to take a serious, very rigorous economic look at the service and insist that those figures flow from the providers. And there's no reason, certainly no technological reason why they couldn't flow on a near real-time basis. We don't have to have monthly reports. You could literally have hourly reports from every provider, which would also help, I think, with the fraud investigation. You can identify patterns of abuse much more quickly if you get the data in real time and you analyze it as intelligently as we now can do. And again, not violating anyone's privacy, but being rigorous about about everything about the service from the financial side. Not only has a long-term effect of being able to plan the service, but it has an immediate, you might say, criminal freezing effect. It has a spotlight effect, concerning effect that raises the concerns of anyone who might be, fraud-oriented. So I think the process should begin retroactively, understanding where the costs were at the beginning and where they are now, real costs, and identifying where, without diminishing the quality of the service or inhibiting the kind of innovations that we want providers to do, providing a reasonable way for the Commission to develop its reimbursement immediate policies and long-term policies for the growth and maintenance of the service.
Any suggestions as to privacy safeguards and also arguments that providers make that this information is proprietary?
Well, a lot of things can be considered to be proprietary. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to practice law here, but it seems that you have this, monopsony situation with the Commission having so much rightful authority and responsibility to the public to demand information that, can certainly be safeguarded about sharing it with competitors. There's no need to do that. I think the Commission in camera or, whatever advisory body gets established could review those, and, we have accounting practices and this kind of financial oversight in other instances. So and I forget what the first one. Oh, the privacy issues. Yeah, I don't think we need to know the originator or the terminating number of any of the calls. We need to understand the pattern of the calls. If we get 6 sequential calls in one input call, right? 6 sequential calls that are all to 800 numbers, repeated at the same time every day, there may be a pattern there. And, I'm certainly not the only one who's ventured out of town and purchased something that wasn't a hotel room or a meal or a car with a credit card, and immediately had, my credit card company ask me if this is an authorized purchase. And I think we need to apply that same kind of rigorous pattern matching ability to this service.
There's some other cards that have been up. I'll get back to you. Dr. Jayakar.
All right. First, to respond to Jim's comment a little earlier about how much economies of scale there are by cost category. I remember seeing the data in the NECA filing for 2008 that about $2 out of the $6.5 for VRS service is related to CAs. So that means about 66% of the costs are for other categories. And without better data, we don't know how much economies of scale there are for each of those categories. So which goes back to better data reporting. And I do strongly believe that this data is related to public funding of services. It is our money, and we need to have access to that data. It is not proprietary data. It is not private data. The public should have access to it. But that's one point. The other point is also about cost allocation. Now, some of the larger TRS providers are also providers of VRS service. Sorensen is not, but there are lots of them who do both. Now, whenever you're confronted with a situation where one of your services is under price cap, as TRS is, or other types of compensation, and one is under cost or rate of return, basically, there is an incentive for service providers to shift the cost from the service that is under price caps or competition to the one under rate of return. So my concern is that some of these larger providers are shifting their costs, their common costs between these two different services and overloading it on VRS. And that is increasing the rate base for VRS services and increases the size of the reimbursements also. So there should be better standards for to make sure that service providers are reporting the data correctly and only reporting under VRS the costs that are directly attributable to VRS service.
Claude.
TDI filed, I believe, last May in the docket, and we asked that the FCC consider a process in which a selected number of consumer representatives could take part in a data review, cost data review in particular. And who uses VRS? Remember, it's us, it's consumers. And you have to remember that over the last 5, 6, 7 years, providers keep telling us that the FCC doesn't pay them enough. So we have the FCC telling us, well, the providers are compensated sufficiently, don't worry. And we're getting two competing stories. And often as consumers, we are stuck in a tug of war. We would like to see the data because then we can better understand who's telling the truth. I'm not saying that the providers are not telling the truth. I'm not saying that the FCC is not telling the truth. But it would make sense. Obviously we have two varying arguments here, and one of them has to be more right than the other. If we could see the cost data, understand the cost data, then we could then accept more, I should say we're more likely to accept whatever the decision is, whatever the FCC decides is the final rate. And in whatever rate you decide must be at a 3, 5 year, whatever term. We cannot go back to an annual rate because the providers do need to have a business plan. They get loans, they have their own plans in line, they have interpreters to hire to maintain their services at whatever level. So it's important that the rate itself, well, whenever consumers actually do get to look at the cost data, we need to understand that there's also historical data and get that information as well. So in the next rate decision, it should be based on actual data, historical data. And the next rate should, the previous rates have been on actual data, the next should be on projected, because whatever costs they have had may not necessarily be what costs they will have in the future. Consumer groups want to emphasize with you that in the rate calculations, we want to see the providers really get into research and development. I want to see providers come up with mobile devices. I want to see providers come up with innovative ways to do marketing and outreach. I want to see providers come up with a way to make their operations more efficient and understand that that requires money, and we need to support them on that. The rate itself, if you were to break it down, you might say, oh, let's say $6.50, $1 goes to this, and $2 goes to this, and another $2 goes to this. We need to see that rate breakdown, because then we would know if you are actually meeting, as the FCC, our expectations on research and development, on professional development, on adequate research and marketing, on efficient call center operations, et cetera. Right now, if we can be part of that data review in a satisfactory manner, then we can support whatever decisions you make and work with you to work with providers, accept your decision, and then move on.
Thank you. Greg.
Just a quick note. Although the Commission has approved the tiered rate, which is, the average is about $6.50, according to the provider submissions of their actual costs, at least according to last May, the actual costs were $4 and something. So it looks like there's about a $2 or so gap. So you're saying, would you also like to know how they use that $2 profit, that difference? Well, another perspective is, are providers are they spending their money on things that meet the consumer's needs? If the providers have this understanding, and the providers have this understanding that consumers' expectations need to be met, then maybe they need to be spending all of that $6.50, maybe not. But again, we need to see the cost data. before we can actually reach any conclusion as a consumer. Consumer groups really, we have a couple, whoever these consumer representatives are involved would sign confidentiality agreements and agree to keep whatever data they see completely confidential, but we need to be part of this process. It would be valuable for us so we can make sure that the providers actually spend their money on certain things rather than heavily on 2 or 3 areas that we don't necessarily care about. So we want to make sure that providers are working on new products and services and that those products and services evolve. We are extremely frustrated with the old dated products that we've had. And we don't want to see that, we don't want to be in the, quote, TTY ghetto again. And the FCC has done a great job in making sure that TRS has evolved, and I commend the FCC for that. As a consumer, our duty is to make sure that you continue to do that.
Thank you. We are basically have run out of time. We'll allow a few more minutes. I see a few 10 cards up, but then we're going to have to wrap it up. Sherry.
Thank you. I just want to briefly say that, for the record, for the consumer input that I've been receiving from the public, we'd like to see the cost transparency become a reality. We all want to be able to see from the providers exactly how that breaks down in their accounting and how they are spending the money. I mean, we have an anecdotal awareness of the results that we're seeing. I've talked with several of the providers who say that indeed they would be willing to do this, but it has to be required of all providers. So I strongly recommend that if we're going to have a workshop, we should also have a workshop with the providers so that they have an opportunity to get into the same space and to hash this out and talk about the contract rates, the requirements, the strictures we're intending to apply and whatnot, and have everybody sign off on the bottom line. And I would like to also thank all of the consumers who have provided me with their input. It's been amazing. And lastly, I also want to thank the interpreters for doing such a wonderful job today. So thank you to them as well. And thank you again for inviting all of us panelists, me in particular from California, and our consumer group to be able to come and represent. Thank you.
And thank you again for coming from California. Sharon.
I just wanted to make a comment in regards to the 3-tier rate. I think the 3-year tier rate that we've had thus far is supposed to diminish over time, if I understand that correctly. It is supposed to diminish over time? Am I right on that? That the tier rate should go down? Okay, well, that's what I understood. That is what's supposed to happen within that system. But it may be that we can provide the consumers with more choices, competition, and better benefits within that 3-year tier rate system if the providers are able to project what type of services they're going to be able to provide to the consumers. And I think that that really seems to work well as a system, the functional equivalence that we all seem to be going for. We're not there yet, as we all keep saying, but we are behind the 8 ball on that in terms of functional equivalence, and I want to be able to walk on the street and make a phone call to my son and say, you know, what else do you need me to pick up at the store for you while I'm in the grocery store today? You know, I want to be able to make that kind of call, which I can't currently do. But I am hopeful that there will be a point when we have that and that it will happen soon and not be delayed too long into the future. And so the providers need to have some kind of motivation to work hard and to provide the best possible technological solutions to the consumers. And also, in the topic of competition, I'm not seeing any, we don't want to see any kind of blueprint where all of the VRS providers have to follow the exact same model statically. We want to be able to have a variety of services, diversity of choices, and basically summing all those concepts up again, just being able to see that diversity. We don't want to see the monopoly and the cloned product occurring. And we want to be able to have the providers provides a little bit more motivation to them to work with the FCC, to work with the consumer groups. I see a great need for education and empowerment, because even with the work that we have done thus far, we have really only begun to scratch the surface. We've only reached out to a few thousand people, maybe, and we haven't even hit 20,000. We're just not there. And there are just so many people out there that don't have the internet, that don't have the opportunity to write in comments on these topics to the FCC. And I think that we need to recognize that we need to see more vlogs showing up on the FCC's website, so that those vlogs, the V-logs, will have the opportunity for sign language to communicate directly with the consumers. And I'd like to see that sooner rather than later as well. But I also wanted to thank the FCC for the opportunity and for inviting me to come here today. And it's been a real pleasure to see this, and I look forward to more opportunities as we go forward into the future on this kind of discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. Last comment, Karen.
As the FCC goes forward in the debate on these issues, I think it's very important to keep in mind the issue of specialized customer premises equipment. It's really tied to all of these issues, and we really haven't gone into it here. There are lots of different ways to approach this, but the bottom line is that because right now this equipment is still being used for a limited market, it's not clear that it's going to be provided by the general market just yet. We hope that it eventually is, and that all equipment is eventually interoperable. But until it is, it's going to be very expensive if that is completely excluded from the equation. And SCPE has always been very expensive. The competitive trends have not been able to bring those costs down. My hunch where that extra $2 went, because there is a gap, is it went for equipment. So the question is, I mean, I may be wrong, I'm just taking a guess, but the question is whether or not the rate for services should also be reimbursing equipment, or should it be separated out? And if it is separated out, should there be some kind of nationwide equipment distribution program or voucher system, something to make sure that people can get the equipment that they need? And I don't think that we have scratched the surface on this particular issue, but I think it's something that the FCC has to consider going forward to make sure that people can get affordable SCPE. Thank you, and thanks for hosting this.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap this up, but you know, obviously we have a lot of work ahead of us. We've covered a lot of issues and could have spent hours more doing so. We do want to continue to receive feedback on these issues. Again, encouraging submissions in the docket CG 03123. So thank you very much to all of our panelists who came from near and afar, and look forward to continuing the dialogue on these issues.